Hello everyone, Loremaster of Sotek here, and let's not waste any time and just get straight into why you're here. My predictions for the Skaven side of the upcoming Rat and the Serpent DLC, which of course is going to feature the hordes of the Skaven going up against the disciplined ranks of the Lizardmen. I'm very excited to get into it, so without further ado, let's go ahead and step right into who I think is the most likely choice to be the legendary lord leading the Skaven, Ikit Claw. Now, for those who aren't super familiar with Skaven, as you might suspect, Games Workshop essentially designed a lord-level character-ish for each of the major clans. So there's one for a Warlord clan, being Queek Headtaker. For the Greyseers, you have Thanquol, and then each of the four major clans has one. Now, the one that Ikit Claw represents is, of course, Clan Scryer, which are the warlocks. They're the mad scientists. They create all the crazy machines, and they have a lot of focus on lightning and magic and combining magic with dark technology to make horrific inventions, but of the purely mechanical nature. So how does Ikit Claw fit into their full scheme? Well, he is the most powerful playable character for them. He's one of the major leaders within Skaven Blight because, as you may know from playing on the Mortal Empires map, Clan Scryer's main hub, like where all of their best arcane workshops are beneath Skaven Blight, because during one of the big civil wars, the Clan Scryer thought, we would probably be very powerful if we set up our amazing headquarters beneath the very capital of all of Skavendom, rather than going out and putting it somewhere else in the world. That way our power base is centralized here. And they managed to pull that off, and because of that, they are one of the strongest clans. Now, Ikit is a pretty interesting character for a Skaven. He's a little different compared to a lot of them because he's actually very successful and very old. Ikit has been around for hundreds of years, and the way he's able to do that, considering that most Skaven die of old age at like 10, is because Clan Scryer discovered a elixir of long life. Now, it's not like Nagash's Elixir of Immortality, where Nagash drank it once and he was just, like, forever immortal, or the original vampires who drank a messed up version of Nagash's Elixir and they became vampires, so they became immortals with an asterisk. The Skaven instead invented a type of magical potion that if you use it, it basically keeps you young and healthy, but it doesn't make you immortal. It just basically reverses old age and keeps you in the prime of your life. But you have to constantly be imbibing it. If you stop taking it, you'll grow old and die, essentially. So you have to have access to it. But seeing as he was one of the Arch-Warlocks of Clan Scryer for a very long time, he, of course, has had continuous access to it. And one of the things that made Ikit Claw super famous is he is actually the Skaven who invented the Doom Wheel. So if you're a big fan of the Doom Wheel and its whole aesthetic, Ikit Claw is the mad genius behind it. The hamster wheel of death. In any event, so let's talk about what Ikit Claw brings to the table. First, he is the most heavily armored and well protected of the Skaven. Because if you look up his model, he kind of looks like an almost Skaven interpretation of a Terminator. And the reason for that is he used to be this really physically imposing, strong, powerful Skaven. And he was even born with white fur. Which, just like for the Lizardmen, albinism, or albinoism, I forget, one of those, is essentially a sign of the gods' favor. The horned rat's most favored servants have white or gray fur. And so when Ikit Claw was born with completely white fur, that was a good sign that he was destined for greatness. And he's always kind of been at the top of the game because of that. However, during one of his experiments, there was a horrible accident, or more than likely a horrible sabotage that he failed to notice, and his experiment exploded and horribly burned a good portion of his body. And Ikit should have died then, but he's very tough and refused to give in to, being burned alive, and basically designed himself an exoskeleton. And it's this crazy iron frame that covers his entire body and allows him to be completely mobile and very aggressive, and if anything, it made him stronger. Because not only is Ikit Claw the toughest of the Skaven, because he has an iron frame that not only augments his natural toughness, but of course, he's covered in armor. So you actually have to hit him really hard to break through his frame or to get through his exoskeleton, because he basically designed it as a plate armor suit on top of it giving him mobility. But it also has a couple of nasty attachments. First of all, he has this really nasty warp generator system on the back that has him kind of protected by a constant little sparking field of lightning that in tabletop essentially gave him a ward save, in that he's able to react, of course, very quickly, and it protects him because he's generating that constant field that allows him to utilize rather bizarre abilities. And he has some other kind of nifty things built into it. For one, he has a Warplock pistol that he keeps on him at all times, which of course is a pistol range firearm that he can draw and fire at you from outside of it. Kind of like, how RoboCop pulls out a gun and shoots, kind of like that. But it is a magical armor-piercing missile weapon that has fairly short range, but he can fire it while moving, and it's really, really nasty, so he could potentially have that as a shooting weapon. Also built into his iron frame, because Ikit wanted to be the best, in his left arm he has a warp, it's called a warp fire projector. And what it is it's basically a miniaturized warp fire thrower. So he just aims his left arm at you, and it pops out of his, pops up and above his arm and just belches this big old spew of warp fire and can just burn the hell out of you. Generally, he only has enough material to enough of the warpstone napalm essentially to fire it once. But I could see Total War potentially giving him multiple shots. Now, how that would work is kind of a toss-up. It could either be that it's just a regular shooting attack, instead of, they could give him the Warplock pistol, and he shoots that while he's running around. And then the Warp Fire Thrower could be like an active, kind of like Throg's Vomit or something, where you would just click on someone and he'd hold out his arm and shoot a fireball at them, or shoot like a big flamethrower. Or they could just give him a flamethrower shooting attack. They'll do one or the other more than likely. Other things that he has is attached to his armor, or powered by his armor, is also this really, really nasty glaive he has called the Storm Demon. And as you can guess, the reason it's called the Storm Demon is because his warp lightning generators power it, which not only make it freakishly strong and it hits as hard as a giant or as hard as a dragon, but it also allows it so that he built it, it cuts through armor like butter. Because it literally, imagine if you could take a weapon and you had lightning on the edge of it. It would make it so intensely hot that it would just cut through armor, super easily. And that's exactly what Storm Demon does, is he's able to swing it around and it just cleaves through armor. So he has super high armor piercing anti-large, I'm hoping, more than likely. And then the last thing is that Storm Demon has Warp Lightning bound into it, or something equivalent to Warp Lightning. It's actually a little, it's about on par with Warp Lightning, but it's a very, very high armor piercing ability where he aims his halberd at you and it just shoots this huge green lightning bolt and it just annihilates everything in its path. So I'm guessing, though, for the Storm Demon, they'll probably just make it a bound Warp Lightning once you have his halberd. And I'm assuming his halberd will be the magic item that he can unlock in multiplayer. You can purchase in multiplayer to upgrade him. I imagine that's what they're going to do, is that he'll have the halberd and he'll have he'll probably have 2 casts of an upgraded Warp Lightning maybe. Which Warp Lightning is a terrifyingly good spell in Total War Warhammer. So that would be an amazing ability. As far as his combat prowess, Ikit Claw is one of the better fighters among Skaven. He's not nearly as skilled as a warlord, but he's much more skilled at fighting than, say, at Greyseer. He's just like Tenenhuan we talked about in the Lizardman video. He occupies a really nice niche between caster and fighter. He's skilled in combat and he hits super hard. But generally, I wouldn't expect his melee attack to be very high, because he's not the most skilled fighter, and he's not very fast due to his heavy frame. But he can swing really freaking hard, and he's very tanky. So among the Skaven characters, I would expect that he's going to be the slowest by a long shot. Like, I'm expecting slow speed, slow attack animation, but I would expect him to have the highest weapon strength of all the Skaven characters, except for Queek when he activates, like, Dwarf Gouger. But that should pretty much give you, I think, a good idea of Ikit Claw. He is a caster, he's a caster, fighter, shooting hybrid character. So there's literally no zone in which doesn't have a presence. You know, he's got 2 different shooting attacks. He's got a bound spell. He's also a level 3 wizard of the lore of Ruin. So just like Tenenhuan, he is like a really, really powerful caster. He's not as powerful as Greyseers or like Thanquol. He's not on their level, but he's just below it. But he's better than, you know, all the hero level casters. So he's a really good spellcaster of the lore of Ruin. He has that bound spell. He has this really hulking iron frame that makes him by far the tankiest of all Skaven characters. And he hits like a truck. I would really like to see for him to have pretty high weapon strength. And I would just expect him, as far as like debuffs, like I said, slow and not very high melee attack. Because like I said, he's not a super skilled fighter. The only time I would expect him for his melee attack to get buffed enough where he could be threatening in a duel would potentially be against a large target. But even then, I almost would rather him have like charge defense against large and just have a better focus on being tanky. I don't see him having as high melee defense as like Tretch, because I do generally find that Tretch is probably Tretch is about the same caliber of fighter, but Tretch is just a lot faster than him. But other than that, the only thing worth noting is that, like, leadership-wise, he's as brave as Skaven can get, which is not that brave, you know, unless he's surrounded by friends. But, you know, he's not, like, super stubborn or anything. He has no problem falling back when necessary, and he's definitely a believer of fighting from the back. I should say, Queek Headtaker is much, much, much more brave than Old Skrulk. Or, not Old Skrulk, Ikit Claw. Ikit Claw is much more along the lines of the typical Skaven Lords, even though he doesn't mind getting his hand dirty. So hopefully that gives you a good idea of the... You know, I don't think comparing him to Darth Vader works as well. Malekith is more Darth Vader. I think RoboCop is a really good comparison for Ikit Claw. The Skaven RoboCop. Perfect. So with that, let's go ahead and move on to the, I think, less likely, but still very interesting Legendary Lord option. The next potential Legendary Lord we'll be taking a look at, who I do think is notably less likely, but I still want to cover, is Throt the Unclean. So just like Clan Skryre has Ikit Claw, Clan Moulder has Throt, who's also fairly old to a good extent. Now, just like Ikit Claw is really famous for inventing the Doom Wheel, Throt the Unclean is super famous for creating the Hell Pit Abomination. So this guy is a freak and is a demented evil monster who tortures and mutates animals into grotesque shapes to create new weapons for Skavendom to unleash. And because of all that, he is by far my favorite of the Skaven special characters. I love Throt the Unclean. So, what can I tell you about him? Well, Throt is this grotesquely obese, horrible-looking rat Skaven creature, and he's very big compared to most Skaven. And the reason is because during his experiments, sometimes he uses his own mutations and growth formulas on himself. And he works a lot with Warpstone. This has caused him to sprout a third arm and has made him morbidly obese and gives him a horrible, horrible sense of hunger, because his gut is so big that he literally has a crazy fast metabolism, which has an upside and a downside. The upside is that it gives him regeneration, which is always a super, super powerful buff. You know, who doesn't love regen on their characters? And a Skaven character with regen is an instant win. However, the downside to this high metabolism is it gives him something called ravening hunger, which is quite literally a ability that makes it so that whenever Throt is fighting, or he is marched. Whenever he basically does something that causes him to overexert himself, he literally will turn to the nearest Skaven and eat them. He will grab an entire Skaven and immediately devour them on the spot because he is so susceptible to something the Skaven called the Black Hunger, which is basically after that Skaven exert themselves because the entire species have super high metabolisms due to being giant rat monsters. They have to eat, and they eat very voraciously and aggressively until they satisfy the Black Hunger. But Throt's is on overdrive due to the growth and experimentations he's performed on himself, which, like I said, gives him regen, but at the same time causes him to get feverishly hungry and start devouring his own troops if he can't keep himself under control. I don't know if they would implement that in Total War Warhammer. I'm not sure how it would work. The only thing I can think of is that, like, if he expends enough vigor, maybe you could use an ability that... The only way I could see it working is if Throt had a passive that made it so if he got exhausted vigor or lower, he would start taking... Like, he would take some damage, but maybe give him an active on a cooldown that allows him to kill a nearby enemy troop or do like damage to local nearby allied troop. Allows him to either like instantly kill a model or instantly do like a fair amount of damage to a nearby friendly unit, and it causes his vigor to go all the way back up to fresh to kind of represent him needing to be in good condition, or else he gets feverishly hungry. Because in tabletop, if he failed his leadership check to like resist his hunger and there was nobody next to him for him to eat, he would actually take damage without his regen being allowed to heal it, because his stomach would basically start eating him. So he was always a guy that made sure to have a ton of troops around him at all times, so he could, constantly keep nomming. So regen, ravening hunger. The other thing that he has is he has an ability that's essentially called Master Controller, which basically gives him a super leadership buff when he's around packs of giant rats or rat ogres or basically anything Clan Moulder associated. So it could be really cool to have him have a unique, I would probably either as a leadership buff or as some kind of other passive to maybe increase their leadership or yada yada. I could see him having an ability that only works on specific unit types, like large creatures like rat ogres. And he could buff their leadership or their melee attack, or they could just give him an active buff that could only be used on large targets that he could use to essentially buff them. Alternatively, they could just give him like an item that might represent that. Speaking of items, he has 2. Like I said, he has 3 arms, and all of them are occupied. In his 2 normal arms, Throt the Unclean wields something called Creature Killer. And Creature Killer is a horrific... It's this nasty looking... They're called Thing Catchers by the Skaven, and they're these giant barbed hooks that they can snap open, and they're kind of like collars, but they all have spikes going inwards. So these collars open up, and then they position them over your leg or your limbs, and they snap them shut. And it's like a bear trap coming in that just slams into your throat and kills you. Or if it's a big enough monster, it basically allows them to grab a hold of the monster by pinning it all the way through its muscles down to its bone, and being able to very painfully force it to do what they want. And Creature Killer is a really, really nasty perfected version of the Thing Catcher on top of being a magic weapon. And so what it does is it not only has Killing Blow, which traditionally in the game translates as anti-infantry, because it allows him to literally one-shot people who are human-sized or lower. But for Throt, it gives him a pretty explicit, massive bonus against all monsters, monstrous infantry, monstrous cavalry, and monstrous beasts. So I don't see him having a anti-infantry and an anti-large bonus. I don't think that's even in the game, or if it is, it's hyper rare. I think there's maybe 1 or 2 ways you can get it, but it's very, very rare on like an item. I know that you could do it with spells, like with Tomb Kings. But for Throt the Unclean, I would probably have Creature killer, give him very, very high armor piercing, and give him a bonus versus large. But he would have very aggressive bonus versus large. So he wouldn't have like charge defense against large. He would just have a really solid anti-large bonus as he runs up and is snapping Thing Killer on monsters. The other weapon he has that his third arm wields is this really nasty whip called the Whip of Domination. And essentially what the Whip of Domination does is it has a super long reach, and if it hits you, it causes major leadership penalties. So it's literally just a weapon with the Discourage ability, which, considering that Throt also has fear and will tend to run around with his monsters like his Hellpits and his Rat Ogres, who also cause fear or terror in the Rat Ogres case, or the Hellpit Abominations case, that is a nasty, nasty series of stacking abilities. A discourage aura ability whip, like that he can snap at you, and it causes your leadership to drop fairly significantly. And then he has Thing Killer to do like significant anti-large or armor piercing damage. Plus he has regeneration going the whole time, and he's tanky and fast, and he is mean in melee. Throt the Unclean is an excellent fighter. The only Skaven Lord who's better at fighting than Throt is Queek. And Throt definitely is way better at Queek than dealing with large creatures. Like, Queek is the king of dealing with infantry-sized targets and characters. Throt is the king of dealing with large beasties. So I would love to see Throt as the ultimate monster killer among the Skaven legendary lords. You know, just with a really fat anti-large bonus, that really sexy regeneration. He's very much like Mortar or most Region characters, actually, in that he has virtually no armor at all. He very heavily relies on his regeneration. But with the combo of causing fear and being able to have a discourage attack to lower enemy leadership that he's fighting in close combat, and, you know, if he's backed up with Rat Ogres and Hellpit Abominations that he's able to either passively or actively give buffs to, I mean, that has the potential to be a sick character that would be super fun to play. And of course, his starting location would be in Hellpit, which is up near Kislev. So, you know, he's already got a perfect slot ready for him, like he could just slide on into. So I don't think Throt the Unclean is coming with this DLC. I think he's coming in the future. I don't know if it's going to be with a different DLC or if it's going to be a free DLC character. But nonetheless, I feel very confident we'll get Throt the Unclean eventually. But I think that Ikit Claw makes more sense right now. That being said, Throt is definitely my favorite of the Skaven special characters next to Thanquol. But of like the big four being Deathmaster Snitch, Lord Skrull, Ikit Claw, and Throt the Unclean. Throt the Unclean is my favorite. In any event, I think that's it for the Legendary Lords section. So let's go ahead and pop down to regular old predictions. When it comes to Lords, I kind of feel like I did during the Lizardman prediction video, where I don't really think the Skaven need a new Lord. The Warlord and the Greyseers seem like they're fine, and that's what they had access to in Tabletop. Of course, there are some people who think Vermin Lord, but we're going to talk about Vermin Lords later in this video because they couldn't lead armies, so I'm not going to put them in the character category. But that being said, I don't want to just leave this blank because that seems unlikely. Personally, I would not at all be upset if CA came out with the DLC and was like, okay, both factions have a new special character or legendary lord, and then everything else is just like units. You know, no new lords for either side. I would be totally fine with that. But that being said, that seems kind of unlikely, so I do think there are two possible lords. The first is, because I feel pretty confident we're going to get Ikit Claw, a lord that would be easy to make by probably recycling some of his assets, which is what they tend to do with characters, is they tend to take a legendary lord and they kind of break down their assets and make like a more simplified version, and that's usually how we get a lot of regular lord characters. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. That's just like a good use of space and function. Like, it's just the way it works. But in any event, something they could do would be to give us an Arch-Warlock, which Arch-Warlocks are, of course, the heads of Clan Skryre. They are the men in charge. And basically, I think they would function a lot like Ikit Claw. You know, I would expect them to be lore casters of the Lore of Ruin, just like the Warlock Engineers or Ikit Claw himself. I could see them having ranged weapons, especially since the Warlock Engineer does not have any ranged weapons, which I've always found pretty weird because it was definitely a class that almost always had a shooting weapon on it, whether it was a Warplock pistol or a Warplock musket or whatever they called it, basically a handgun. I always found it odd that the Warlock Engineer didn't have that. Granted, you can bring him with a Doom Rocket, which is essentially a shooting attack, but it's more like a special weapon. So if the Arch-Warlock were in, I would really like to see them as an actual shooting lord, either with a pistol a la the Vampire Coast style, or with some kind of more interesting weapon like a flamethrower or a handgun. That way, you know, they're more about just a different style, essentially. But my thing with them would be only Ikit should be heavily armed. The rest of the Arch-Warlocks do not wear iron frames. I would expect them to be, essentially, I would expect them to be like Greyseers in that they don't have a lot of armor, but I would expect them to have slightly better combat stats. I would expect them to have maybe more defensive weaponry to give them better combat stats if they were to fight at range. But in exchange, I would not have them have Arcane Conduit, because Arch-Warlocks are explicitly not nearly as good at magic as Greyseers are. Like, when you have Ikit Claw, for instance, Ikit Claw next to Lord Morskatar, who's the Council of 13 member for Clan Scorir, next to them, like, nobody is better at casting in Clan Scorir, and Ikit Claw is nowhere near as strong as Thanquol, for instance, or most Greyseers. They're just a slight but noticeable tier above him, you know? So for Arch-Warlocks, I'd like to see a combat-focused character who did not have Arcane Conduit or any super magic like that, but, you know, had access to magic, Lore of Ruin only, and maybe had a shooting attack. You know, like a nice hybrid, but doesn't have the heavy armor of Ikit, but is faster. Doesn't have maybe his cool weaponry, and isn't as good of a caster, but can make up for it in other means. But that's kind of my idea for them. Like I said, I'm not super sold on it. And for the Skaven, I should say there is a character I very, very, very much want, but that's in the hero section. Which, speaking of which, let's go ahead and step to the next thing I want to talk about. So another option, especially that could be good since we're not likely getting Throt the Unclean, based on the evidence I have seen and heard and watched, is a lord or hero in either the Master Moulder, which could be either, or the Packmaster, which would be explicitly a hero. So let me kind of just talk about the difference between the two. In tabletop Warhammer, units like Rat Ogres, Giant Rats, and all those guys could not be trusted to just run around and do their thing on their own. They were, you know, they're just stupid animals, and the Skaven have often done terrible things to them and don't trust them not to turn on them and eat them. So Clan Moulder would always send out handlers to watch them and make sure they're going the right direction. And there were two tiers. The lower tier were known as Packmasters. And Packmasters are very, very weak but swift Skaven whose job was to basically run around with whips and snap them at the back of the Giant Rats and the Rat Ogres to make sure they go the right way. These could make for an acceptable hero choice, though they're not very flashy, so I don't really see them working as well. But then there's the Master Moulder, so the Packmaster I don't really think makes a great option unless the Master Moulder was a lord. But let me tell you about the Master Moulder, because these guys are pretty slick. So Master Moulders are these lightly armored, combat-focused characters, and they're actually very skilled warriors. They're easily on par with most heroes in Warhammer Fantasy. But they have a really cool set of weapons they can pick from. The Master Moulders, like I said, are kind of they were the closest thing to a lord you could take, or a character, of Clan Moulder without taking a special character. And they're very, very skilled combatants, but they kind of rely on being very, very quick and having longer range weaponry while they goad all of their monstrous denizens into battle. So generally, they came wielding either they could have a hand weapon or a whip, or they would use both their hands to either wield a great weapon, like a sword, a great sword, or a great axe, or what have you, or a things catcher, which we have talked about extensively, which are very, very nasty. But my favorite weapons that they could have access to were two electric-based weapons, which were the super goading tools, and were, although they were good for goading monsters, they were particularly good on the battlefield, which were the Electro Whip and the Shock Prod, which both of them are exactly what they sound like. The Electro Whip was this nasty multi-pronged whip that took 2 hands to wield, and when it would snap, it pulsed with electric power that would just shock the crap out of people and could just ruin people's days. It was a super fun weapon that allowed their attacks to basically kind of explode with energy, so it would hit tons of people. So it was like a super good AoE weapon. On the other hand, they could have the Shock Prod, which the Shock Prod is also exactly what it sounds like. It's a really long stick that passes a absurd amount of electricity through. It is not really so much as a weapon to goad monsters as it is to kill the one closest to you to encourage the other ones to go forward. And if you were to hit an enemy with it, there is no armor that will save you, because if anything, the armor will just make it worse, and it will just murder your ass. They basically stab you with it, and you have enough time to scream before you just like fall over dead and smoking like a husk. But it's a shorter range weapon than the Electro Whip, and actually requires the Master Moulder to get, close enough to swing. So either of those I think would make for really, really interesting looking characters. I would love the idea of like some crazy, not heavily armored, but skilled fighting hero or lord for Master Moulder, like running into battle alongside the Rat Ogres, providing them buffs, and he gets in there and just starts like electrocuting people in close range. Like, that just sounds super fun and awesome to me. But that's kind of the Clan Moulder hero lord option, which I think the Master Moulder in particular could work easily as either. But that should do for that, to at least inspire your imagination and decide whether or not that sounds like a cool idea for you or not. But let's move to the hero who I actually really, really want, which is the last hero we'll be talking about today. I should also note, before we dive into this last one, that the Master Moulders, if they're in, should definitely have an anti-large bonus, because the Skaven need an anti-large hero, in my opinion. It just makes for a good Guardian-esque character. Not true Guardian in a sense, but they could use a character who's really, really good for getting into the battles with cavalry or monsters and like really pulling their weight. So just that aside, let's go ahead and step into my third and most interested option. The last option that I really want to see is just the Chieftain. The Chieftain is the only true Skaven hero that we're missing. And I know for a lot of people, these fighting hero characters kind of fall into a bit of a generic category where they're like, do we really need them? Like, we have a warlord or whatever. And I think, yes, we do need them. Because one thing every army is supposed to have that a lot of them don't right now is a combat-focused hero character who kind of occupies a more defensive, or a niche that allows them to stay engaged. Because right now for the Skaven, you can take a Plague Priest who is he's very offensive, and he has physical resistance, I believe, which allows him to have a little bit of resistance, but it's really easy for them to get nuked, and their primary role for most players is as a summoning-focused caster who runs out and just spams summons. But for most people, you have to take them on a Plague Furnace for them to be really worth it or effective. And if you're going to see them, that's generally how you're going to see them. Then you have your Assassin, which is very fast, and it can stealth, which is super cool, but it's very offensively focused, and once again, relies very heavily on physical resistance for its dodge save. That if your enemy has like a caster with Fireball or Shin's Burning Gaze or Vindictive Glare or Spirit Leech, they can just kind of turn to your assassin and go, and he's dead. Or if you have someone who's particularly skilled, you can easily just focus them down or surround them, and their low leadership causes them to break and run. And then, of course, you have the Warlock Engineer, who is he has some armor, but he's not the best fighter, and I think he has a little bit of an anti-large, because I think they have a halberd, but it's not really a fighter class. It's kind of it's kind of like the Plague Priest, where it's a pseudo hybrid class, but it's more of a support character, whose goal, most people, what they do is he's just a really cheap character that you slap on that armor to make him drain enemy units, and then you just throw them into battle and hope your enemy doesn't notice. What I would like to see is actually the Chieftain, which would be a really a very good combat focused character who can wear fairly heavy armor and come with some interesting upgrades, especially since we don't have a just a good shielded hero character who can run around your character following them around and provide certain buffs. I mean, you could build them any number of ways. You could build a Chieftain with a great weapon and have them be a hyper armor piercing class. That would be super cool to see that. Or you could have them with a shield and some kind of weird Skaven weapon and allow them to be running around the battlefield as a much more tank focused character who, what if they had a cool little buff that allowed them to, they could have Verminous Valor, just like the Warlord does, where they it goes boom and they're able to scurry away from battle. But for the Chieftains, it'd be really cool, in my opinion, to see a character who could provide a very localized leadership buff for Skaven, and it wouldn't even have to be a big buff, maybe +4, +6 leadership that would help them resist fear and terror and help anchor really good frontline focus builds like Storm Vermin, and be a character that you could put in that frontline engagement and wouldn't have to worry about him just getting nuked instantly because he doesn't have a super high health pool or he relies purely on physical resistance. Just a nice shielded character with heavy armor for a Skaven, very reasonable and high melee attack, melee defense, whose goal is just to be an anchor for your line while your lords run around doing crazy stuff, or your casters hang out in the back, or you have your warlock engineers or arch-warlocks back among your war machines buffing them, or your shooting weapons buffing them. I really think one I would like to see from the Chieftain would just be a very solid frontline fighting focused character who maybe has a localized leadership buff. And to make a good fighting character, you could either give him a great weapon so that he does really, really high armor piercing and can actually threaten enemy elite infantry and enemy characters, or give him 2-hand weapons and let him, that makes him too much like the assassin. So I'd probably either give him just a great weapon or a hand weapon and shield that allows him to just be very tanky in the front line, just keeping your guys together and focused on a battle line so that your lord doesn't just always have to be right smack in the middle, and it can allow your lord to kind of lead better from the back. And if they wanted to make him more interesting, you could even, in tabletop, you could design them with all sorts of crazy abilities. You could give them a warp musket, which was the handgun, or you could give them a warplock pistol, which is the pistol. So, you can make them the range character, too. I don't care. I just really want to see that character in, because, it's a character that allowed you to really design him to fit whatever role you needed him to. So CA could easily pick one of his many roles and assign him to that so that he helps develop the hero leadership line a little bit. It's just a character I really like seeing, and one of my crusade, you could say, is just to get at least the army books into the game. All the units in the army books into the game, with very minor exceptions. And I don't think the Chieftain should be one of those exceptions. So that's my spiel on the Chieftain. I really, really hope we're getting him in this DLC. I would not be upset if we got the Master Moulder instead, but I hope we get a new hero, and I hope it's one of those two. So that's it for characters. Now let's get into the stuff that I think you're really here for. Alright, so when talking about new units, just like last time, I'm going to focus on the units I think are the most likely new additions, and then we're going to kind of go down from there. So for the most likely units, I'm going to kind of start with the simplest one, which are giant rats. Now, I will admit I'm a little bit biased due to a fairly good-looking leak that happened on Reddit 6 months ago, 9 months ago, and the leak had a very Clan Moulder, Clan Scryer-ish theme, which I think still is likely the case, or at least, if we're getting Ikit Claw, which is still where my vote is, then I feel strongly that a Clan Scryer focused DLC is likely. But I still think some of the simpler Moulder units might make their way in. So let's go ahead and go over those. Like I said, the first one I'm going to start with is giant rats. They're pretty much what it just says on the tin. They are big rats. Giant rats are not the size of... When you think giant rat, it's not like a large rat. We're talking about rats that are literally the size of dogs. So they're basically Chaos Warhounds with like slight differences. But in a nutshell, they're really just Chaos Warhounds, and that's all you really need to think about when you think of them. Now, I think as a unit, they would be exceptionally powerful for the Skaven, and it should be pretty obvious why of that. It would just give the Skaven a very, very fast unit to go after skirmish units and war machines and ranged units and allow them to do that. Now, that being said, because that would potentially make the Skaven better than intended, I do think that giant rats would suffer from rampage to kind of even out their balance and not make them super OP. But if they had rampage and their whole spiel was just that they were fast and had like okay combat stats, then I imagine the turnaround for that would be that they were hilariously cheap. Like, I'm talking like maybe 300 costs or 450 for, you know, like a full unit of them, which even if they had rampage and were hard to control, I still think for that cheap, they would actually be a really, really useful unit. Especially because all you would need to do, either in single player or in multiplayer, is you could just hide them in a forest or back further along the line and wait until the full battle is begun and is like going at it. And when units start breaking off, boom, you send in those giant rats and you just start having them mow down fleeing units who are either fleeing due to terror or, you know, being broken. And you make sure the giant rats pursue them all the way off the board or pursue them until they shatter. That would be a super effective unit that would provide a lot of really powerful options for the Skaven. So, giant rats. Moving on. Keeping with the Moulder theme, another unit that I could see being likely for this DLC, though it might be better to save them for a later one, but I'm going to go ahead and put them in the likely category for this one, are wolf rats. So these guys you might not be super familiar with, even if you're a Skaven player, if you weren't like attached to 8th edition at the hip. And that's because they came out in the Monstrous Arcanum, which is one of my favorite books from all of Warhammer Fantasy because of how beautiful it is, even though it's super expensive. And it's a collector's item now, essentially, especially since it's out of print. But in any event, wolf rats are really, really scary. Because where giant rats could get to the size of dogs, wolf rats got big, like to the size of wolves. Which, for those of you unaware, if a lot of people think, oh, a dog equals wolf. When no, wolves tend to be a lot bigger. Like, sure, there are dogs that are bred specifically to be large as wolves, but when, you know, we're talking about like an average medium large sized dog is like 60 pounds, 50 pounds, and wolves are like triple digits. You know, those are huge animals. And wolf rats are kind of these. The wolf rats were giant rats interbred with wolf DNA or genetics to create a hybrid creature. And these creatures ended up being so horrifically powerful and dangerous that Clan Moulder had to put a lot of them down and even kind of attempted to stop producing them. But a lot of them kind of just broke out and they just sort of live in the depths. And Clan Moulder was just kind of like, oops. That being said, in the Monsters Arcanum, wolf rats kind of existed before them, but they were like legends and myths. But in Monsters Arcanum, Clan Moulder brought them back into the fold and kind of started experimenting with them again. And it got bad enough to the point that Clan Moulder, A, doesn't remember what their original design was, and B, doesn't know who or when they were created because it's such a mess, and most people who work with them end up getting devoured by them because they're just fast creatures that are very strong. Even though, so they're much faster than anything else the Skaven have. They are the fastest critters the Skaven ever created. And they're fairly skilled combatants. They hit as hard as a Saurus warrior, to an extent. So I would expect them to be a very, very fast-moving wolf-like unit that has the highest speed stat in the Skaven roster, has very high weapon strength, though I would say very low armor piercing, unless CA decided to give them a certain upgrade, and their goal would be to just run around the battlefield and tear into people. So kind of like the Ice Wolves for Norska. kind of like how they're better than Norskin Warhounds, I would expect wolf rats to be like that to giant rats. Except for just like, compared to giant rats, they're way faster, hit harder. The one thing they don't have going for them is that their leadership is butts. But to make up for that, they have a ludicrous ability in tabletop where on the charge, they do crazy amounts of damage. So I would like to see them like have high weapon strength, like I said, low AP though, very, very fast movement, decent melee attack, very little melee defense, but have a huge charge bonus. So that if they manage to catch you in the flank or the rear, or you're a unit that's not well designed to deal with them, they will just rip you limb from limb. Which, I mean, they literally, I'll put it this way, they had 2 special rules in tabletop, which were called Go for the Throat and Tide of Death, which was literally just, that was a unique rules to them. Which Go for the Throat basically meant that whenever they got a charge, they just like instantly obliterate whatever they charged. And Tide of Death is just that when they start tearing into you, they really start tearing into you. Now, there are some potential upgrades CA could give them, just like CA did with the Chaos Warhounds. Because for those of you who aren't aware, Chaos Warhounds in tabletop can come basic, or you can upgrade them with Scaly Skin or poisoned attacks. And the way CA handled that is they gave one version Scaly Skin and the other version Poison. Now, what you can do with Wolf Rats is they can also have poison attacks, or they can have Warpstone Shard Teeth, which basically they have a bunch of pieces of warpstone shoved into their claws and their fangs and in their guts, and it gives them magical attacks and armor piercing, which could be terrifying. That can make a good regiment for now. And they could also have an upgrade that was called Bloated Mutants, which made them slower but tougher, which that one doesn't seem very likely because it kind of goes against what they would be good for. But I could see like giving them poisoned attacks being really good for the basic version. Just a super fast moving unit that hits hard on the charge and is very aggressive and has poison. I mean, that would be a killer unit. So that's Wolf Rats. And I'll have an image up here so you can see how horrific they are, because they have like distended jaws and like muscles exposed, and they have spikes coming out of their flesh, and they're just ugly, ugly creatures. Next up on the docket, I have Warplock Jezzails. Now, these guys are easily the most requested unit, I think, for the Skaven update, and I am willing to bet something stupid that they will be in the DLC. Like, I am horrible with spicy food, and I will, like, eat some ridiculously hot pepper if Warplock Jezzails are not in the game, because there's no way. They're just too critical to the Skaven roster and are too famous a unit. If you're somehow living under a rock and haven't heard of these guys, Warplock Jezzails are basically sniper rifles, or sniper Skaven. These are guns that are so big that it takes 2 Skaven to carry them and set them up. And what they do, since it takes 2 people to carry and set them up, is that the other Skaven, so that you have the sniper, who's the one that actually aims and pulls the trigger, and then you have the other guy who helps him with his equipment, but he carries I think it's called a Pavis, which is basically this really big shield, and it has 2 functions. A, it's a really big shield that they plant into the ground, which they put the muzzle, or the end, I guess it's the muzzle, of the Jezzail on, so they can stabilize it and aim and fire it. And the other function it has is it's such a big shield that it also blocks incoming enemy missile fire. So the way Jezzail should work is they should be crazy long ranged. At least the range of the deck gunners in the Vampire Coast army. Probably a little bit longer, but at least that long of range. They should have heavy armor piercing and magical bullets, which, because they shoot warpstone ammunition, which warpstone cuts through armor like it just doesn't exist. It melts armor on contact, and it will just obliterate you. Even Dwarf Grommerl struggles really hard to hold back a warpstone bullet fired by a Jezzail. Like, these things can bring down dragons with a headshot very easily. So, super high armor piercing damage with magic because of the warpstone bullets. And then they should be more accurate and dangerous than deck gunners, and the reason I say this is because deck gunners have some other bonuses due to being undead. they're unbreakable, so they never flee. They'll just keep shooting till they die. Because they're undead, they can't like be charged by a unit and be forced to flee and then get like taken out while they're running. You don't have to worry about them shattering. You only have to worry about them getting killed. Jezzails, on the other hand, you could like charge a unit into and they break and run, and you can like get them away from their army and run them off the side of the table. Or, there's all sorts of weaknesses they have because they're not undead. And, they don't cause fear because they're not undead. So they don't have a lot of those innate bonuses that the deck gunners do. So they should do more damage to compensate for that. And they also have, of course, their giant shields, which I think should provide either gold tier or silver tier shields against enemy missile fire coming from the front. So, that is a substantial resistance against missile fire, but to me it makes sense. Like, if you're going to be trying to trade fire with a Jezzail, you want to be shooting something big, like an organ gun or a cannon, or, something that is going to fire big bullets that those shields don't block, because the shield notation, of course, only works for small arms fire coming from that direction. So that's how I would like to see the Jezzails. Of course, the counter to that should be that they should be very slow, and it should take them a fair amount of time to set up, and their reload time should probably be pretty low to make up for the rest of that. But other than that, they're a skirmish formation unit, so they tend to have a decent number of models in a unit, and they spread out pretty far, just like the deck gunners do. But yeah, that's Jezzails. Can't wait to see them. They gotta be in. This will instantly be a bad DLC if there's no Jezzails in, so hopefully we don't have to deal with that. Let's keep this Clan Scryer train rolling. Next up on my docket is my personal favorite of the weapon teams, which, for those unfamiliar with weapon teams, they were, in tabletop, they were these little Scryer creations that you could attach onto one of your rank and file units that would basically follow them around like a child following around its parent, and they would just like shoot at stuff that tried to charge the unit and basically act as a cover guard for them. But in Total War Warhammer, they kind of separated them into their own thing. So an example of a weapon team are warp fire throwers. Warp fire throwers are literally weapon teams, but in Total War they obviously separated them into their own thing. So I imagine that's going to be the case here. And the last two units I'm going to be talking about for the likely section are weapon teams. The first one I'm going to talk about, though, are the Ratling Guns. These guys are hysterical in tabletop, which I say that like a haha, I love these guys, but if I'm sitting across from a Skaven player and I see a Ratling Gun, I'm like, oh fuck, like I hate Ratling Guns. But they're basically just machine guns. They're these, Gatling guns. They're these big, I think 6-barreled guns, and the barrels just spin really fast and just spit out a spew of armor-piercing bullets. And they're fairly short range, but boy, can they ruin your day. In tabletop, the only downside to them was that they had a very high chance of misfiring, and when they would misfire, they would do all sorts of crazy shit, like spin and like shoot in a random direction, or explode, or whatever. And so for Ratling Guns, basically, I would just have them be a short-range missile unit that does very, very high AP, but has like stupid short range. But to make up for the fact that you have to get them so close to the action, they should, of course, have like a hilariously high rate of fire that allows them to just like pew 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 to like oblivion. Just like Jezzails, they have Warpstone ammunition, which means they should have heavy armor piercing and magic damage, which is, not a bad thing most of the time. And the cool thing about them is, unlike most weapon teams, they actually, I guess, like most weapon teams, now that I'm looking at it, they have heavy armor. So just like warp fire throwers and the other weapon teams we'll be talking about, they are reasonably armored for a shooting skirmish unit, but they should be the guys that you just bring up on the flank, or you bring up to an exposed enemy like greatsword unit or whatever's charging at you, and you just go and just like unload into their face, and you just sit there hoping that they mow them down before they get charged. I'm not sure if they're going to have them where like they just have a really low reload rate, or if it's going to be like they can fire for like really fast for a certain amount of time, and then they have to stop and reload, and then they fire again really fast for about 10 seconds, and then they have to stop and reload. That would be more realistic and accurate, but I don't know if that can work within the Total War engine. I guess we'll have to find out. In any event, yeah, that should do it for the Ratling Guns. So let's go to the other weapon team I would like to talk about. So the last unit I'm going to be talking about in the likely units section, and this should be the end of this video, unless when I put all the clips together, this is like way over an hour, in which case I might back this one up. But in any event, is the Poisoned Wind Mortar team. So you might be thinking to yourself, Poison Wind, I know that. And you're right, those are the Poison Wind Globadiers, the dudes that run up with gas masks and they throw these little handheld orbs at you like they're doing shot put at the Olympics, but to deadly effect. That's exactly right. The Poison Wind Mortar, though, is just what it sounds like. Instead of a bunch of guys just throwing some small globes, you get two guys with a back-mounted mortar who shoot really big globes. And I love these things, and they were super fun in tabletop because they could fire indirectly, which means that they could fire without being able to see you. Which there are some, which I think there are still some like mortars and catapults and stuff that can do that in Total War Warhammer, but they're basically much shorter range than most catapults. So like if a catapult could shoot, say 100 meters, these guys could typically shoot like maybe 60 meters in comparison. So I would love though to see them as a skirmishing catapult unit where you just have like a bunch of gas mask wielding Clan Scryer guys like going like, you know, halfway to your front line, and then they all just hold still while the dude in the back like just loads this big old deathly glass ball, and then they just fire it and hope for the best. You know, fairly inaccurate, but wherever it hits, it should just do hysterical amounts of armor piercing damage, just because poison wind gas does not give two shits about how good your armor is. And once again, it's a Warpstone weapon, so magic damage. And just like the other two weapon teams that I've talked about, the Warp Fire Throwers and the Ratling Guns, they wear heavy armor. So they're moderately resistant to enemy missile fire like arrows or crossbow bolts. And they can stand up to very, very light enemy pressure. You know, anything substantial is going to cause them to break and run. But I love the Poison Wind Mortar. It's such a cool unit, and it's one of my favorites. It's probably my favorite weapon team, or at least my second favorite. So that's going to do it for this video, hopefully, if I timed everything out roughly correctly. So be sure to come back tomorrow when I will be releasing the second part 2 for the Skaven DLC, Sotek's Skaven DLC predictions, where I'll be talking about units that I think are less likely, but could still possibly be in, which is going to be pretty much everything I didn't talk about here, like Vermin Lords. Vermin Lords I have put into that category, and I will talk about why tomorrow. So thanks for stopping by, guys. Please let me know which of the things I talked about today you're the most excited for down in the comments, or if you think another unit should have been on this list that I didn't include, or if you think there is a unit on this list that should not have been included. So thank you all for watching, and I'll see y'all tomorrow for part 2. Thanks, guys.